Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming director here at the OVL. Thank you for coming to the Osterville Village Library today. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. Today we have Gil Newton, one of the founders of the Barnstable Land Trust, longtime teacher and author, here with us today to talk about the salt marshes of Cape Cod. Salt marshes are some of the most important ecosystems along the East Coast. Let's listen as Gil takes us on a tour of these fascinating wetlands. But before we jump into Gil's talk, I want to take a quick moment to say how important the work of the Barnstable Land Trust is to Cape Cod. They protect the places you love through conservation, care, education, and inspiration. Barnstable Land Trust is a community-supported nonprofit whose mission is to preserve the natural resources and special places in the town of Barnstable and nearby areas. So without further ado, Gil Newton.
Good morning, everybody. Yes, I am one of the founders of the Barnstable Land Trust, and we do a lot of different walks and talks throughout the year. So go on the website if you're interested in participating in any of them. I think you'll find them a lot of fun. And I know some of you have already been on them in the past. I am currently a professor of coastal ecology at the Cape Cod Community College. Actually, I've been teaching there since the 1980s. And I would like to take you on a tour today of my favorite ecosystem, which is the salt marsh. Now, we're going to basically talk about salt marshes on the Cape, but we're going to kind of focus on one in particular here in the town of Barnstable, that of Crocker Neck. How many of you have been out to Crocker Neck in Katuitt? Some of you have been on a walk with me out there, undoubtedly. And I chaired the commission many years ago when we preserved that area for all time. So really one of my favorite places in the world is Crocker Neck. But it has the characteristics of a salt marsh, and so many others do as well. And when you first go into a salt marsh, this is what you'll see. There's tall grass in the foreground here. This is called cordgrass or Spartina alterniflora. Now, a few years ago, one of my students said, "Professor, what's the most important plant in the world?" Well, of course, they're all important, but I selected this one because ultimately cordgrass supports all of our commercial shellfish and finfish here on Cape Cod, either directly through grazing or when it breaks apart and washes offshore, it forms something we call detritus, which is then broken apart by a lot of microorganisms. More about that in a minute. Spartina here is also very important because it acts like a barrier between the open water and the upland areas where we have our properties. So it helps prevent erosion along the shoreline, and it's very resilient when the waves come in these particular spots. It also is a habitat for a lot of little critters. If you go down into the marsh itself and look into the cordgrass, you'll see a lot of little animals that we'll talk about a little bit later on here. So there's a high biodiversity in this area as well. When you look at it though, you say to yourself, how can a plant survive in salt water? Wouldn't it lose water to the environment? Wouldn't the cells collapse? Normally that would be the case. You pour salt water on your house plants, they're not going to survive. But Spartina has a couple of unique adaptations to survive in this area. One of which is that they get rid of the salt through the leaves. They actually secrete the salt with specialized cells. So if you go down to a marsh and you rub your finger along a blade of cordgrass, you can actually see and feel the salt crystals. It gets rid of the salt. Also, it's in an environment where the root systems have to have some source of oxygen. But in a salt marsh down below, it's an anaerobic condition where there's little or no oxygen. So it has another set of specialized cells called parenchyma, which transport oxygen down to the roots, and it creates a little oxygenated atmosphere around the root system that we call a rhizosphere. It's also very resilient, like I said, to any kind of heavy wave. So if we have a big nor'easter, like we did a few weeks ago in May, it looks like it's cleansed after the storm leaves. It really can resist that. And finally, it helps protect our freshwater drinking water source on Cape Cod from saltwater intrusion. As you all know, we have a single source aquifer. We pump our water out of the ground. It's replenished by rainfall and snowfall. And yet we are vulnerable because of the close proximity to the ocean. This helps block that saltwater intrusion from getting into our drinking water. So this plant alone does a lot of really good things for us. And I often tell my students, when you see the word salt marshes, those S's should be dollar signs, because it really is very, very significant. Now, the other plant that is pretty obvious in the marsh is the salt marsh hay, another species of Spartina called Spartina patens. And this represents the bulk of the marsh that you see here. This one can also be inundated by salt water as well, but not as often. And so you see this in the upper portions of the marsh, and it represents a large part of the biomass of the salt marsh ecosystem. It also is a different zone, as we'll talk about zones in a minute. And those zones also have representative animal life that exists in those particular parcels as well. Now, this is my favorite slide I'm going to show you for several reasons. Let's see if this works. Yeah, it is. First of all, this material that you see here is all decomposing plant material and mud that is built up over time. And why is that important? Because another significant thing about salt marshes that we only recently learned in the last, say, 5 to 10 years, is that salt marshes are very efficient at sequestering carbon in the atmosphere and in the land. Now, why is that important? Well, we hear a lot about climate change these days, and a lot of carbon getting into the air and the water, which is having a negative effect on a lot of ecosystems. This is trapping that carbon free of charge over long periods of time. And as it turns out, studies have shown that salt marshes and mangrove communities in the South are 3 to 5 times more efficient at storing carbon than tropical rainforests. So we hear a lot about how forest systems are important, and they are, but these systems are even more significant because those wet soils tend to trap a lot of that carbon. So that's one of the things that is interesting to me about this picture. You can actually see it. Another thing are these structures right here. We call these hummocks, and this is how a salt marsh actually grows. Now and then these chunks of peat, which is that decomposing plant material, breaks away from the marsh, and it settles in a creek or somewhere. And if conditions are just right, grasses will colonize it, rib mussels will move in, and eventually it tends to build up the marsh. Now, one of the big issues on Cape Cod these days, and there's a lot of research going on at places like the Locoit National Estuary Research Reserve in Falmouth and the Cape Cod National Seashore in the Lower Cape, is to see the impact of rising sea level on salt marshes. We know the sea level is rising, particularly in the Lower Cape, but there's a great deal of erosion in places like Chatham and Provincetown. But what is happening to the marshes? Well, they tend to be migrating landward as sea level rises, if they can. There's a lot of development there, makes it very difficult to do. So there's some interesting experiments going on at those two places where they're growing Spartina grasses, they're trucking in sand and mud, and they're trying to build the marsh up to help deal with some of the effects of rising sea level. And so far, the results seem to be pretty positive. So that's another thing about how we can build up a marsh and maintain its diversity. So this is a really neat picture, and obviously this is a super low tide. When you go around the Cape, you'll see that no two marshes are exactly alike. Another favorite one of mine is Gray's Beach Marsh over in Yarmouth, you know, where the boardwalk goes out there. Totally different than Crockett, much steeper profile. Has the same kind of plants and animals that you would expect, but it's a different marsh in that sense. And of course, the Great Barnstable Marsh here in this town is also another popular and favorite one of mine as well. Now, I mentioned the detritus, all that Spartina breaking apart. And here's a picture of what it looks like. When it does, you can see this, particularly in the upper portions of the marsh, as the Spartina just kind of breaks apart. Some of this will linger in the marsh and build up those peat layers that you saw in the previous slide, whereas a lot of it might get washed offshore. And now an interesting thing happens. All kinds of microorganisms, bacteria, nematode worms, little tiny creatures, they start munching on that debris, and they pass that energy all the way out the food web. Hence my statement, how important it is to commercial shellfish and finfish, either directly or indirectly. So this is a really important plant, and here in Massachusetts, it is protected under the State Wetlands Protection Act. Okay, so another characteristic of marshes is that they're pretty muddy. This is down by the beach here. And there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, there's this mud flat in here, and this is a nice habitat for fiddler crabs, and we'll see some of those in a minute. Another interesting thing happening here is it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but see where this dock is? Behind it here, I believe the marsh is growing. Again, we're hearing about how marshes are sinking and sea level is rising and so forth, but I've been walking out here for about a half a century now, and I can actually see many of these hummocks building up. I think that little corner there is an emergent salt marsh. And eventually, I predict this is going to get trapped in there. I've had students go out there and make predictions too for their exams, and I get all kinds of answers, but I suspect that it's going to be closing in on itself over time. Another thing about the marsh is these creeks along the sides are also filled with mud. And it's kind of like quick mud. You don't want to step in it because you will sink. Good story about that is I took a group of high school students out there one day and I told them not to go into the creek. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever you tell 17-year-old boys not to do something, guess what? Well, sure enough, a couple of them went in, lost their sneakers, stuck it right off their feet. It was October, so it wasn't that warm, and they learned their lesson. I hope anyway. Another characteristic of salt marshes are these large areas, which a lot of people mistakenly call tide pools, but the technical term are pans, P-A-N-N-E-S. This is the large pan at Crocker Neck. It floods. You can see where it's connected to the bay here. That's Papaneset Bay. And at high tide, it really does flood. But at low tide, the mud can be exposed. So what happens is a lot of animals will come in at this time to escape predators, to feed, to have their young, different times of the year. These become very important areas for biodiversity. The grasses themselves, you can see, are beginning to build up over here as they break apart. When this is exposed, there's a creek that comes right down here, and there's a little tiny pan over here. When I take walks out there, we have a good tide. I'll often have people surround the little pan and jump up and down on the marsh. When they do, the earth moves, which shows that the sediments are actually absorbing that water, and it's not really solid earth. It's kind of like quaking earth. And if you do that, experience that, you will never forget it. Okay, some of the plant life here. In those mudflat areas, we often get Salicornia, also called glasswort. And this is some people call it the sea pickle. This is an edible plant. For years, historically, it actually was used as a pickle and as a source of relish. It is a very salty plant because its adaptation to the salt is to store it in the tissues. It's a succulent plant. It's also one of the early colonizers. So if you have a mudflat area that's exposed, this is one of the first plants that will come in to basically change the environment for the other plants to follow. I find it rather salty myself, so I don't really recommend eating it. In the summertime, we get some interesting flowers that come out right in the marsh itself, such as the salt marsh aster, looks just like all the other asters. An aster, as you see here, is actually several flowers in one. They have disc and ray flowers together. It's not a single flower, it's a composite of flowers, which is for many years it was referred to as in the compositae family. But it's very similar to the dandelions and goldenrods and many of the others in that family. Today it's, I believe, called the Asteraceae. But it's a pretty little plant that grows right in amongst the Spartina. In the foreground, it's not the best picture here, but in the foreground is the sea lavender. You may see that? And that is a really attractive plant in the marsh, usually in the upper portions of the marsh. Sea lavender for many years was being picked indiscriminately to be used in dry flower arrangements. And many conservation commissions on the Cape embarked on an education campaign to get people to stop doing that. Because when you pick that plant, you prevent it from reseeding itself. And so it cannot grow in that area anymore. So I think the campaign has been working pretty good because I'm now seeing some pretty large populations of this in many places. By the way, if you go out to another favorite spot of mine is Dowsett's Beach here in Austerville. If you go there and over to the marsh side, there's a nice marsh there as well. You'll see all on that trail sea lavender growing probably in a few weeks from now. If you go into the upper portions of the marsh, down from where the land comes to the marsh, You can see these very narrow zones of plant life there, and this is one of them. This is called disticus or spike grass. You can always tell spike grass, even in the winter, because when the leaves die, they kind of curl like this. And so it's easy to identify. But it forms a very narrow band along the upper portion of the marsh. And that's what I mean when I talk about zonation. These are distinct zones that plants have where, depending upon the elevation, their exposure to salt water, exactly where do you find them? Remember that big pan that I showed you a few minutes ago? On both sides of that, it looks like it's the same, but I've had students go out there, we measure the slope on both sides and look at the plant life, and there is a difference between it. It's just a slight increase in elevation, but it does impact how many of these plants that you would find. And growing with it is usually this one. This is called black grass or juncus. And again, it forms these narrow zones right in the upper portion of the marsh. So if it floods very often, or if the marsh is beginning to move because of rising sea level, these plants will disappear because they can't survive those harsh conditions that the cordgrass can. Here's one we don't like to see, and I'm sure you've all seen this one. This is Phragmites. Phragmites, of course, is an extremely invasive plant. We call it the tall reed. Phragmites is seen all over the place. And at Crocker Neck, it's not found on the side where the pan is and so forth. The water's too salty. But there's another trail that goes near a freshwater wetland. And down the end of that, there's a hefty population of Phragmites. Phragmites is extremely invasive, like I said. I had students measure populations over at Scorton Creek and Sandwich, and they found over 100 plants per square meter in some of the places. So nothing else can grow in such a congested area. It's a difficult plant to control. If you cut it or burn it, you're going to get more because it sends a hormonal signal down to the roots and the underground stem, the rhizome, to grow more plants. The best way of controlling Phragmites, and many of towns have adopted this, is to allow tidal flow into the area to increase the movement of salt water. Because Phragmites cannot live in salt water. Though it can live in fairly high salinities, again, we measured some in salinities as high as 15 parts per thousand, which is about half that of seawater. So it can live in those areas. If you're familiar with Sandy Neck Beach, and a friend of mine who's the manager there, Nina Coleman, for her master's degree many years ago, she actually got started with me at Four Seas a long time ago, but anyway, she did her master's degree on controlling the Phragmites in the swales between the dunes. There's a lot of rare and endangered plants in those swales, and after a big storm, Phragmites came into the area. So what she did is she injected the stem with an herbicide, just enough to affect the plant, but not affect anything surrounding it, and it was very effective. For several years, it was very effective. However, Phragmites exist in such quantities in some places that would be too labor intensive. You couldn't do that. But in her limited area, it was quite successful. She has told me recently, however, the Phragmites has come back, and so they have to do it again. For the most part, what most towns have done, from Provincetown down to the canal, they've actually opened up the tidal flow, and it's been very effective. So we have a history in the town of Barnstable in using the marsh. These are some pictures from the publisher of my books, Nancy Shoemaker, who's also a historian. She lent me these photos. And you can see that we used to use the marsh as a marsh hay for feeding farm animals, cattle and horses, and also used as a source of thatch and insulation in people's homes. They used to go out to the marsh and collect it. Of course, now it's totally illegal. You can't do that anymore, nor would you want to. But nevertheless, you can see that on the Great Barnstable Marsh, it was done. And I often worried about, gee, what would be the impact of farm animals walking down into a marsh? You know, it's such an irregular terrain. And I said, wouldn't there, be a lot of broken legs and what have you? And she told me that they used to have these specialized shoes made for these animals so they could navigate the marsh, similar to like snowshoes that we have. So there's an example of them out there collecting the hay. Another thing you might have noticed too is that many of the salt marshes, think of maybe the ones over at South Cape Beach in Mashpee, have these narrow parallel roads that obviously were dug up many years ago. And almost every marsh in New England was dug up. And it was during the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a group started to help find employment for young men during the Great Depression. So thousands of people were hired around the country to do all kinds of outdoor work. A lot of our national parks had plantings and so forth. And what they did is they would dig these ditches also for drainage for two purposes. One, for agriculture, but also to try to control mosquito populations, with the thinking that if you can increase the water flow, you would decrease the amount of mosquitoes. That doesn't work, by the way. And today, part of the restoration of marshes in this area is to try to reclaim the original terrain of the marshes and bring it back to what they used to be historic. But anyway, that was something that people did a long time ago. That's a really neat picture showing them exactly what they did. See, and you see these really I mean, you can still see this all over the Cape. Still these kind of creeks that have that were formed and done. When you walk down to the marsh, however, it's also very interesting, particularly around Crockett, because they have this woodland area that goes down into the marsh area. And it's something kind of interesting to see some of the plants that are growing there. This is the star flower, which goes right along the edges. Now, these plants will not flower after the trees have leafed out. So this one's already passed around here. But this is a pretty little one that you'll find. You also find things like bearberry. Bearberry is kind of an interesting plant. You can actually put it on your own property. It's great for erosion. It puts out these little fruits for wildlife. You don't have to water or fertilize or use any kind of chemicals at all. If you've ever been down to the Marconi area in Wellfleet, the dunes there are completely covered with this particular plant. I was taking a group of students from Lyon, France out there many years ago. And we're walking along the trail. And I mentioned they spoke English. I didn't speak a word of French, but they spoke pretty good English. And I mentioned bearberry. And I kept walking. When I turned around, the whole group was way back there. They thought I said bears. They were looking around like this. No, everything's fine. Although I will predict one day we will have bears on Cape Cod. They're coming. They're in Wareham now. They're coming. So anyway, not yet. There was one here though. Wasn't there one a few years ago? On vacation or something? All right, this is another very common one from the Arctic all the way to the tropics. This is reindeer lichen. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship between an alga, single-celled alga, and a fungus. And scientists today believe it's a parasitic relationship, that the fungus actually kills some of the algae cells when it traps them. I have students take a piece of this, bring it back to the lab, we chop it all up with a razor blade, throw it under a microscope, and you can see the filaments of the fungus wrapped around the green algae cells. So it's really two plants in one, although neither the alga or the fungus are a plant, but it's basically like that. And when that happens, it creates or becomes a whole new species. It's the only thing like that I am aware of. There could be 1 million species of fungi on Earth right now. No one really knows for sure. And you can always remember that because remember this little rhyme that Alice Algae met Freddie Fungus and took a liking to it. I didn't come up. This is another fungus that we see growing near the edge. This is the coral fungus. You usually see it in the fall, and you can see where it gets its name. It looks just like the coral. There's some really spectacular ones that we have around here. This year, or excuse me, last fall, I didn't see a lot. You really have to have a lot of rainfall and so forth, but I did see a few. And here's a plant we all need to worry about. This is poison ivy. Toxicotendron. Poison ivy, though, is actually very common around marshes, particularly on sand dune systems that may be near the marsh, because it's a highly effective plant for erosion, and the berries can be fed on by over 24 birds without any impact. You come in contact with a sap, whether it's a broken leaf, a stem, or whatever, and you get in contact with a substance called urushiol, which can cause dermatitis. As some of you know, you can be very seriously ill from it. So the best thing to do is to avoid it. Here are some of the berries down here. This time of year, it's easy to identify, those 3 leaflets together. But in the winter, it's just a little twig with a little terminal bud on it. It can be a vine, a woody vine. It can be a shrub. All of that exists out at Crockett. It's very common out there in the woodland area. So you have to be careful. So you know, we really don't have a lot of organisms we have to worry about on Cape Cod. You know, there's a plant, poison ivy, there's a little tiny animal called the deer tick, which can carry the bacteria that can cause Lyme disease. That's something, and, you know, don't go swimming if you see seals, because their predator might be out there too, known as a great white shark. Other than that, no big deal. And I know you will agree with me, in North Florida, everything there wants to kill you, where I did my research. So, but at any rate, here it's not so bad. We do get jellyfish now and then, though, I'll point that out too. And don't worry, I am getting to the animals. Another thing on the zones, all on the outside of the marsh is this beautiful little shrub called marsh elder. Forms a ring all the way around the marsh. Again, this is Crockett Neck. It's a little bit higher elevation. And it just grows, like I said, in a ring completely around the salt marsh. Okay, my favorite group, as everybody, some of you know, are the seaweeds. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them today, but if you're interested in seaweeds, there's still some extra copies of my seaweed field guide. They are free, help yourself. Half of those species in that book I collected from Dowsett Beach here in Austin. Anyway, this is one of the good guys. This is rockweed, Fucus vesiculosus. And you can always tell it's that particular species because it has these paired air bladders right here. Okay, confession time. How many of you have ever popped these air bladders? All right, stop doing that. And the reason is because they have air in them that help it float to the surface where it can maximize photosynthesis. Even though it's a brown seaweed, it does have chlorophyll in its cells to allow it to make its own food. Yes?
Do you feel like there's less of this now than there was 20 years ago? I don't.
Maybe
see
in
it
some
much.
spots, I'll talk about that in a minute, because some people are collecting it.
Okay.
And using it for shipment of clams and lobsters and things like that. There are restrictions in the state of Maine on the taking of rockweed. I don't believe there are here, so it might be happening. Also, rockweed is a cold water species, and our waters are getting warmer. I am seeing fewer kelp species. You know, we don't see those in a marsh, but I am seeing fewer kelp and more red algae. So, but in a marsh, this is really abundant and very important, and it grows right along the banks of the marsh. Now, it's important from several points of view. It actually is a habitat for a lot of little animals because it has mucilage in its tissues that keeps it moist even at low tide. So a lot of animals will hide under the fronds to escape the desiccation and from the heat, particularly in the summer. So if you lift up the fronds, you often see a lot of little tiny critters, some of them attached to the seaweed itself. It also covers up another layer of animals called the ribbed mussel. I'll show you some pictures in a minute so you can see that. So think about that for a second. The top part is the cordgrass. Down below is the rockweed, and that covers up the ribbed mussels, which are embedded in the bank. We've now done some studies which show that those 3 species are working together to help hold that bank in place. It's like a 3-dimensional canopy that is basically collectively holding that bank in place. So remove either one of those, you tend to weaken the bank and reduce its impact on, or increase its impact on erosion. So it's really important from that point of view as well. And it is very, very abundant. In addition to that, it can live a long time, well, a few years, and so it also stores carbon in the salt marsh. So that's a good guy. Here's one of the bad guys. This is codium. This is a green alga that was introduced into our waters. I know some of you have heard the story about it before, but bear with me as I repeat it, because we really should know about this. Here in Austinville, over at Dowsett Beach a few years ago, in January, I went down there to collect some seaweed for my class. It was so thick in the water, it was interfering with the waves. And there are places on the Cape in the summer, not too far from here in Yarmouth, for example, where it just comes up in huge piles on the beach taller than me. Some of the hotels have to have it trucked off in the morning so that their guests can enjoy the beach while they are there. Codium was introduced into our waters in the late 50s, early 60s on a shipment of oysters from Japan up to Canada and down into New England. It has only recently, I say recent 10, 15 years, become a nuisance here because of 2 reasons. 1, the water is warmer, and 2, there are more nutrients in the water. So a lot of algae are nitrogen-loving species, and this is one of them. But it also has an advantage over other species, and that is it can reproduce several ways. If you were to just tear this in 2 and throw it back in the water, You've now got two. Because it can grow by something called fragmentation. There are no cross walls between the cells, so the cytoplasm flows throughout the whole organism, basically making it a one giant cell. But it also has in the tips specialized structures called utricles, and these release male and female gametes into the water. Fertilization takes place, and a whole new alga can grow. But interestingly enough, it has a third way of reproducing. The female gamete can actually grow under certain circumstances into a whole new alga without fertilization from the male, which gives it kind of an unfair advantage over many of the native species that have very specific life cycles, may have a microscopic stage in the winter, and when they start to grow in the spring, their habitat has been completely covered by this. It's also a nuisance to shell fishermen, because this will grow right over, especially down here, right over the filter feeding siphons of shellfish, preventing them from feeding. It's very buoyant. It will lift the shellfish right out of the water column, and hence its common name, the oyster thief. So what can you do about this? Well, I don't think anybody's going to object to you taking it off the beach and using it in your composting, because I do. I would recommend you take some of the dry ones at the upper portion of the beach, because there's nothing still attached to it. But it also, I use it as insulation on my roses and azalea bushes and things like that. I can't make a dent on it though, so there's all kinds of research to possibly use this as a biofuel, maybe even as a source of fertilizer. Who knows? But at the moment, we have a problem with that particular species. All right, let's get to the end. So here's the ribnet mussel. This is the very common one that grows in huge numbers all along the banks of a salt marsh. I have a picture showing that. There they are. They form really large clumps together. If you ever tried to pull mussels apart, they're attached by really strong structures called byssal threads, which is a very strong protein. And the mussel just completely, if you excuse the phrase, clams up at low tide. So it can survive even being exposed to the air. Now, this one doesn't show the canopy. I want to show the mussels. This doesn't show the canopy, but often cases you see the rockweed growing right over it. A lot of people confuse this one with the common raisin that you see in mudflats, but this is called the stout tagalus, and it is only found in salt marshes. And it's similar, it's related to the razor clam, but it's its name, stouter. It's not as long or cylindrical as the razor clam is. Of course, we're all familiar with the quahogs. Wasn't it Quahog Day in Massachusetts yesterday or the other day, first day of summer? Quahogs are really important. What's kind of interesting is that you can actually age a quahog if you rub your finger down these really deep grooves. Quahogs can live 20 to 25 years here on Cape Cod. There are some deep water species that can live up to 200 years. But this one's about 20 to 25 years. This one here, you got to be careful that you only look at the really deep grooves, because all those other lines can be caused by waves. So this one's probably about 6 or 7 years old. Next to it, I don't have a lot to say about this one. Whoops, went the wrong way. I don't have a lot to say about this one, except that it's probably the most common animal you will find at the beach. It's the slipper snail. They exist by the gazillions, if that's a word, very, very common. Is the only gastropod around here that actually filters its food rather than using a specialized structure. But the quahog is also interesting because underneath you can see a purple coloration, and that was used as a source of currency by Native Americans that they call wampum. They made jewelry out of it, really beautiful jewelry out of it, and used it as a source of currency. Okay, the scavengers of the marsh are these little critters here. These are the mud snails, and they also exist in huge numbers. They're feeding on all that detritus, little bits of food, algae. If there's a dead fish in the water, they all congregate and they break apart and recycle those nutrients right back into the environment once again. So again, if you look at low tide in some of the creeks, you will see huge numbers of these. We tried to do a study of the population ones because there's actually a mathematical formula that you can use where you can kind of estimate populations. But accessing them was too difficult because you had to get into the mud and it was just too much. So we abandoned that. Instead we did periwinkle snails, which are a lot easier to do. This is an interesting snail in the marsh. It's called Melampus, which is also called the marsh snail or the coffee bean snail. It's a little tiny snail. What makes it different from the others, it has a primitive lungs. So it has to breathe air. So at really high tide at Crockett, you'll see them all at the top of the grasses, clinging on for dear life so they don't drown. There's few pockets of at Crockett where I see a lot of these. I've seen quite a few also over the marshy area at First Encounter Beach in Eastham, which is one of my favorite beaches. All right, we have the moon snail too. The moon snail, if they get into a particular area, they're found all throughout the Cape. They have a structure called a radula, which drills a hole through the shell and then sucks the meat out. So if you've ever found a shell with a perfectly round hole in it, of a clam or whatever, a mussel, probably caused for this animal here. And what they do is they hide under the mud. They have a large foot that they inflate with water, and they crawl along till they encounter a clam. And that's when they feed. They are very carnivorous. In fact, they're even cannibalistic. They'll attack each other if they are hungry enough. So we do have moon snails in all these habitats. All right, here it is. This is the fiddler crab. So at low tide, when you go down to the water, and they're out there right now, probably if it's low tide and the heat, they love it. They build these little holes you see in the marsh, in the upper portion of the marsh, not so much of the tall grass. Then you go over to sandy neck, go into the tall grasses, you don't see a lot of fiddlers, but you do see them in the upper portion around the muddy areas. And they also have these little balls of sand that they have dug up along the sides of their homes. They can exist in huge numbers. I teach a marine science program at Falmouth Academy in the summer. In fact, we're starting Monday. And there's a marsh we go to called Chappaquiddick in Falmouth. I don't know if you're familiar with it. At low tide, this is not an exaggeration. There are thousands of fiddler crabs, like a horror movie almost. You walk along, they're all parting as you walk along. It's really quite a sight to see. And it being a bird sanctuary, birds like to feed on them, so it's really good. Anyway, this is the male, because it has the large claw here. This one's right clawed, some of them are left clawed. Now, if the male gets into a fight, and he uses his claw, by the way, in courtship and in defense, if he gets into a fight and he loses his claw, he will regenerate another one on the other side. It takes a while, they don't live very long, 2 years maybe. It takes about a year to regenerate the other one, but that's what will happen. And so again, I was doing a group of high school kids over at Ocoee Bay for a week, doing it again this summer. And I told them that the first day, and they said, we're going to keep a count. We're going to all these different places, we're going to keep a count. So they counted about a couple of hundred fiddler crabs and looked to see if they were left clawed or right clawed. Do you know it was 50-50? Not a scientific study, but nevertheless, kind of interesting. So yeah, this is an important animal in the marsh because they aerate the marsh when they dig the holes. They fertilize it with their waste. And on top of that, they're also a major food source for larger crabs like blue crabs. There's also one called the marsh crab, which lives in the banks, for birds. And even raccoons will come down from the woods to feed on fiddler crabs. So they're a major food source. Speaking of blue crabs love the muddy substrate that you find in a salt marsh. And Dowson's Beach has a large blue crab population, Crockett Neck has a large one. The town of Barnstable has regulations posted at both of those places for blue crabbing because they are edible, very good eating. A blue crab is a very aggressive animal. It's not one you want to pick up with your hands. You know, you can pick up a spider crab or a rock crab, no big deal. But you don't want to pick up a blue crab because they can actually rotate their claws behind them and they will pinch. They will draw blood. So again, I told those little kids at Falmouth Academy this a couple of years ago. I heard this blood-curdling scream. I went over, there's a 7-year-old boy with one hanging off his finger, it was bleeding. I actually had to break the claw off and then open it like this to get it off his finger. And I told him he got the better part of the deal. He kept his finger, the crab lost the claw. But it's easy to mistake them for others because they don't look bright blue. You gotta look at down, whoops, I did it again. You gotta look down at down here. These are also, it's kind of hard to make out. This is one of the 2 crabs we have in the Cape that can swim. So they have these little paddles behind, so they're very fast. The carapace itself is kind of green, but you can always tell you have a blue crab if you see these sharp points here. And then there's 9 more along the margin. That gives it away. So sometimes you just find a shell at the beach and it's kind of bright pink. because all those pigments have been bleached out in the sun. But if it had any sharp points, it was a blue crab. It was a blue crab. Anyway, they're really interesting animals. You put one in a bucket though, it goes like this if you go by. So you have to be real careful in handling. It's absolutely, with the students I teach in the summer, the most popular animal we deal with because it's so aggressive and they, they see it as a challenge, I guess. Okay, quiz question. This is in, I think, in green book you might have. This is actually a sea cucumber, which is an animal called an echinoderm that's related to sea stars or starfish, sand dollars, and sea urchins. And it's kind of a remarkable animal. It's got a little sluggish animal. This is a group that some kids and I found stranded in this seaweed, and we rescued them and put them back in the water. It actually has small tube feet, just like a sea star does, and it has a unique way of protecting itself. If you were to disturb it in your hand, it would spit out most of its digestive and reproductive and respiratory systems onto your hand. And then it can regenerate new one later on. So that's its method of protecting itself. They like to live right down in the muddy sediments themselves with their bottom feeders. But now and then I've seen a few wash up on the beaches. I am not seeing sea stars or sand dollars like I used to. They have been declining dramatically in our waters. There is a wasting disease in particular that's affecting the sea stars. And it's affecting them on both coastlines, by the way. Okay, this was at Crockett. This is the Portuguese man of war. Missing most of its tentacles, probably a turtle or a boat or somebody got it. I thought it was a plastic bag when I first saw it, and it washed up. Now, this is about 2 years ago. Both hospitals are reporting cases each summer now of people being stung by this. The Portuguese man of war has these really long tentacles that are loaded with stinging cells called nematocysts. Very toxic if you come in touch with them. However, what a lot of people mistakenly think that this is a jellyfish, they are not true jellyfish. They're animals called siphonophores, which means that all along the tentacles, they have these specialized polyps that have specialized functions: defense, feeding, reproduction, and collectively, they form a colonial animal. So it's not a true jellyfish. If you see it, you should avoid it because it is very, very dangerous. All right, here's my favorite, the horseshoe crab. And again, I know some of you have heard me talk about the horseshoe crabs in the past, but let me just take a couple minutes to review some of it. The horseshoe crab is not a true crab. It's more closely related to spiders and scorpions. It's been on the earth over 450 million years. It predates the dinosaurs by millions of years. It is an extremely important animal because we use a sample of its blood to test all equipment and materials that come in contact with your blood in the United States. So if you have a flu shot or a vaccine or surgery, it's all been tested with the blood from the horseshoe crab for the presence of dangerous bacterial endotoxins. If they come in contact with it, the blood clumps immediately, and the doctor or the pharmacist knows not to use that sample. And it is widely used here in this country now to test everything. So it's probably saved thousands of human lives. In fact, they've even taken it up to the space station because who knows, they might come in contact with some microorganisms up. They don't know. They haven't yet, but you never know. And they want to be able to detect that in case. The horseshoe crab is a harmless animal. You can pick it up. It won't bite you, sting you, poke you, or anything like that. You can put your hand in the claws, it'll tickle you. Never pick it up by the tail because it's attached to some important internal organs and that could harm the animal. Hold it like this. The animal's going to be moving back and forth. It's not trying to stab you. It doesn't understand why it's in the air. It's trying to right itself up, which is what it uses its tail or telson for. The horseshoe crab has 10 eyes. It's got a pair of compound eyes up here. It's got some more eye spots here and also underneath the animal, so it can maneuver itself in the environment you see above and below it. And it looks pretty ferocious, but like I say, it's absolutely harmless. Remember, the dinosaurs, T-Rex walked the earth about 95 million years ago. This goes back 450 million years ago. There's only one species in North America, Limulus polyphemus. That's this one. There are 3 other species in the world, and they're all in Asia. The numbers have been declining. There are new regulations now to try to protect the animal. For example, in Massachusetts, they're no longer allowed to take them during spawning season. During the spring spring high tide, the female comes up to the beach. She will lay up to 80,000 eggs. Those eggs are a major food source for a lot of migratory birds, such as the peacock. And then the male comes up and fertilizes them. Maybe 1 out of 80,000 will survive to adulthood. They can live up to maybe, some people say as high as 30 years, most say between 20 and 25 years. And every year, and you can see them here in Austerville, in late August or September, the beaches are covered with their molts. They're not dead crabs. When this animal gets too large for its shell, it comes out through the head. It's now about 25% larger. And it takes about 12 to 24 hours for it to harden. Then it swims into deeper water where it will hibernate for the winter. So you find this perfect replica of the animal along the beach. Those are the molts. It's a good time to collect them, by the way, is late August, early September. And I get a phone call every year. There's horseshoe crab deaths over here. I know they're molts. I know they're molts. And by the way, they will keep molting until they reach reproductive age, around 12, 15 years. So sometimes you'll see a really large one that's got all kinds of hitchhikers on it, barnacles, algae, slipper snails. They stop molting. The female is larger than the male. You can also tell them apart if you flip it over. The upper pair of claws in the female are shaped like pincers, but in a male is shaped like a boxing glove or a fist. So they're amazing, amazing animals. Yes.
So I was just wondering if they're used for blood, testing, are they raising them, can they raise them domestically in captivity so that they're not?
When they take the blood, by the way, they do not kill the animal. They put it in a holding tank. They will release it within 24 hours. They mark it, release it within 24 hours, and they do not recollect that same animal. So, but to get to your question, the firm in Falmouth, Woods Hole, where they started all this, actually has released something like over 1 million horseshoe crabs that they raise in aquaculture. Now, they're monitoring to see how successful that is, and they have to have permits to be releasing that animal because they eat clams and worms too, so they don't want to wipe out another population. The numbers in Massachusetts have been inching upwards.
Okay.
And they've done their own studies to see what the potential mortality is from bleeding the animals. Does it weaken them? What does it do? And they found that there's no significant difference between their mortality rate and that of nature, that of background. Now, conch and lobster fishermen can kill them. They can take up to something like 30,000 a year for bait. And that's being debated right now, whether they should continue that. Some people have suggested, and they've done this in some cases, that and there's all kinds of regulations when they take these animals. They have to be kept cool, they can't be held by the tail, they have to be returned to the environment, they have to monitor and give the information to the state on every single one that they take. But one of the things they're thinking that if they have some that are weakened from the bleeding, give those to the fishermen and use those for bait rather than take some fresh ones out of the environment. But it's all being debated. You'll have to make up your own minds about this, what is appropriate, what isn't. What we do know is that it's very valuable in medicine. So there's even a synthetic form of the substance. So the substance is called LAL, Limulus amebicide lysate. There's a synthetic form of it that they've been testing in Europe with some success. The FDA's been kind of sitting on it for years. They want to be sure, from their point of view, that before they approve it, it's just as efficient and safe to use as the real McCoy. So my hope is that someday we will be able to synthesize that and these animals will never be taken. Some states, I believe last year, I think it was Connecticut last year, said you can't take any more horseshoe crabs at all. I think that, yeah, New York, they've had some problems with it. There's about 4 or 5 facilities in the country now that are taking these animals. But again, they're so valuable. You may come across occasionally a dead one on the beach that has like a little marking on it because there's all kinds of monitoring. Here on Cape Cod and other places, they're kind of keeping track of the animals. So there's a lot of people really looking out for this animal. I'm optimistic about it. I'm cautiously optimistic that the animal will be okay. There is another theory, and one that I subscribed to for quite a while, and probably still do. This animal could also be a canary in a coal mine for us. It could be telling us something about the marine environment. We know that it's much richer in nutrients. We know that it's warmer. We have good data in this. I can tell you, looking at the algae, that it is changing. Maybe this animal is saying the same thing. There's something going on in the environment. You have something called synergistic effects where you get the combination of things that result in something you didn't quite predict. So who knows, but the good news is a lot of people are watching this very carefully. And so, yes.
The Cape Cod Museum of Natural History had a international horseshoe crab day for
Yes, I know.
2019.
Yes, and I think they're gonna do that again. Yeah, and they bring in all kinds of experts on this. Like I say, there's a lot of people doing research in this field and really keeping close watch on this. And I think it's not just because the animal is valuable medically or even ecologically. I mean, this animal's been around the earth for so long.
Yeah.
I think it's, be ashamed to lose it. But one of my favorite things is when and I've seen quite a few this summer already, is when I had some kids from Orleans Elementary School out in Chatham 2 weeks ago. And we found quite a few, and I love showing it to them because, they overcome that initial fear that a lot of people have. So anyway, it's a great animal. As is this. This is the great blue heron, the largest bird that we have here on the Cape. What's interesting about this bird is we're seeing more of them. They're overwintering on the Cape and have now for a few years. They're really interesting. They nest in the top of trees. They love the salt marshes, particularly low tide. They are very good at fishing, and they can stand perfectly still for a long period of time, and then zap, they grab a fish that might be swimming by. They also can see you before you see them, because they will immediately take off with a large squawking sound that I think a pterodactyl must have sounded. Really, but they're beautiful birds. They have a large wingspan. And of course, this is a success story. My last animal here is a success story of the osprey. We all seen ospreys now. And when I grew up on Cape Cod, I didn't see them. They weren't here. The pesticide DDT had a huge impact on their growth by interfering with an enzyme that allowed them to lay their eggs. So they're laying their eggs too thin or not at all, and the population collapsed. That pesticide, when it was first introduced back around World War II, was very effective at controlling a lot of mosquito populations. But mosquitoes can reproduce very quickly. It only took a small percentage of them that were genetically immune to that pesticide to survive, pass that immunity on, and just recover their entire population. Now you have super mosquito, but the pesticide, which is embedded in fatty tissue, got passed all the way up to the food web, and the animals at the upper part of the food web didn't do so well. So the eagle, the osprey, many others, those populations collapsed. When we banned DDT back in the 70s, it took about 15 years or so for it basically to break apart and be cleansed in the environment. And now this animal is off the endangered species list. It's actually common. You can drive around town and see nests and see the birds everywhere, which is a success story in conservation. And I always tell my students that because I want them to be optimistic. I want them to be hopeful for the future. These are young people, and we need to encourage them to continue studying and learning and making the right decisions because they're going to be stewards of this environment. And so to me, this is what we can do. When we remove that environmental stressor from the environment, we can make a big positive impact. So the osprey, by the way, is superb at fishing. It can account for the diffraction of light when it goes diving in the water, crashes in the water, picks up a fish, holds it in its talons parallel to itself, and then takes it to its nest. Somebody just built, I don't know who did it, but somebody built a whole new nest, a platform over at Crockett Neck, and it's now occupied. There is a nest there. All right, I mentioned algae blooms real quickly. This is one that just appeared recently, last few years on Cape Cod. This is at Crockett Neck. The Barnstable Water Coalition brought it to my attention. It's a red seaweed called Heterosiphonia. It was introduced around, it's not in my field guide. It was introduced around 2009 or so, I believe, in Rhode Island. It's spread all the way up to New England now. Very nitrogen loving, but unfortunately, when it dies and decomposes, it looks like this. And seaweed in huge quantities can give off hydrogen sulfide gas, which can cause respiratory ailments in a lot of people. So it's a problem. This is where I found the sea cucumbers. I think there's a couple down here that you can see. And it can be a real big problem in some of the places. I've not seen this yet this year, so I'm hoping that maybe, it's not gonna be a problem, but it's something we have to keep track of. And then I have to show you this, because do you remember the winter of 2015? We actually had icebergs on Dowson's Beach. This is Crockett again. This is Papaneset Bay, frozen solid. So for those of you who are in the sunny south, good for you, because this is one of the worst winters we've had. And I grew up on the Cape. Everything, it was hard getting there. There was about 1 inch or 2 inches of ice on the path all the way down. We had many days of 0-degree temperatures and below. We had, I don't know, 4 or 5 blizzards in a row. And this was the day it was just completely frozen. So that hasn't happened for a while, for at least 10 years, so we'll see. And then, of course, I want to end with this photo. This is the pan that you saw earlier when it was all flooded. Here's that little one I was telling you about where people could jump up and down on. There's Papaneset Bay. There's a creek right in here that comes into the pan, and the trail goes along here so people can see this. It's open to the public all the time, and it's really a beautiful spot. I do walks out here for the Barnstable Land Trust quite often, 2 or 3 times a year. So check the website to see when the next one might be coming up, and you're all certainly welcome to go on that walk with me. And I do believe that is my presentation.